Why Leonor's marriage could spark scandal. The camera would find her in uniform first. Pressed fabric. Controlled posture. A young woman standing inside a centuries-old architecture of expectation. Every movement rehearsed not for comfort, but for continuity. This is Princess Leonor of Spain, and nothing about her future belongs solely to her. For Princess Leonor, marriage is not a private choice, it is a national test, where love, tradition, and Spain's future collide. The Spanish crown does not survive on romance. It survives on restraint, on predictability, on the quiet assurance that tomorrow will resemble yesterday closely enough to feel safe. Continuity is not abstract here, it is embodied in visible presence. In titles that must never feel improvised. In personal decisions that are weighed not by the heart, but by history. Leonor was born into an institution still healing. An institution shaped by exile, restoration, dictatorship, and democratic rebirth. Modern Spain did not inherit its monarchy gently. It negotiated it, conditioned it, bound it tightly to constitutional limits and public trust. That trust is fragile by design. It must be earned repeatedly. And this is where marriage enters the story, not as a celebration, but as a fault line. Because for an heir apparent, marriage is never about compatibility alone. It is about optics, about alliances without treaties, about what the public can accept without feeling excluded from its own national narrative. At first glance, the question seems simple. Who will she marry? But that is not the real question. The real question is whether Spain still believes the crown understands the rules of modern legitimacy. Here is the first uncomfortable truth. The monarchy does not get to redefine tradition at will. Tradition is renegotiated only when the public consents, often silently, sometimes angrily, always conditionally. And Spain remembers what happens when that consent erodes. For Princess Leonor, marriage is not a private choice, it is a national test, where love, tradition, and Spain's future collide. What many outside Spain misunderstand is this. Scandal does not require wrongdoing. It only requires symbolic misalignment. A partner who appears politically inconvenient, culturally distant, socially unrelatable, or worse, strategically careless. By minute 2 of this story, the audience usually believes they understand the risk. They think it is about gossip, about tabloids, about public opinion turning cruel. But the real risk sits deeper. What happens if marriage reframes the crown as outdated, or unmoored? Royal legitimacy in the 21st century is built less on bloodlines and more on perception. The United States watches not because it reveres monarchy, but because instability travels. The United Kingdom watches because it understands exactly how personal decisions metastasize into constitutional debates. Canada and Australia observe quietly, aware that symbolism can ripple across Commonwealth consciousness. Germany evaluates through the lens of post-monarchical memory, alert to how institutions justify their relevance. Spain does not exist in isolation. Its crown is read internationally as a stress test for modern constitutional monarchy. If those words ever attach themselves to Leonor's marriage, the damage would not come from outrage alone. It would come from doubt. Doubt that the institution still knows how to protect itself. History offers no mercy here. Every European monarchy that survived into the modern era learned the same lesson the hard way. Personal happiness is permitted only when it reinforces institutional stability. Anything else becomes a liability. This is the living thread of continuity. National identity is woven into these rituals. Engagements, appearances, ceremonies, long before vows are exchanged. And yet, something remains deliberately unspoken. Spain today is not Spain of the past. It is regional, plural, politically fragmented. Catalonia remembers. The Basque Country remembers. Republican sentiment never vanished, it simply learned patience. Against this backdrop, any marriage that appears tone-deaf, overly elite, or disconnected from civic reality risks reopening unresolved questions. Not loudly, quietly, persistently. For Princess Leonor, marriage is not a private choice, it is a national test, where love, tradition, and Spain's future collide. At minute 8 of this story, a deeper mystery surfaces. Not who she loves, but who decides what is acceptable. The Constitution is clear in language, but ambiguous in practice. Approval mechanisms exist. Advisory structures operate behind closed doors. Silence often signals consensus, or fear of confrontation. What happens if consensus fractures? By minute 10, the institutional strain becomes visible to those trained to see it. The careful pacing of public appearances. The calibrated distance between personal identity and symbolic role. The crown preparing contingencies without ever admitting they exist. This is how institutions protect themselves, not through declarations, but through preparation. And then comes the point of no return. The moment when a choice, once theoretical, becomes irreversible. An announcement, a photograph, a presence that cannot be retracted. At that moment, the institution either absorbs the decision, or resists it. Not shouted, not splashed, but whispered in boardrooms, newsrooms, ministries, and foreign offices. By minute 19, the future threat is no longer abstract. It is political, symbolic, constitutional. If the crown appears misaligned with public expectation, lawmakers gain leverage. If legitimacy weakens, reformist voices sharpen. If continuity feels broken, survival becomes conditional. This is not drama, this is governance. For Princess Leonor, marriage is not a private choice, it is a national test, where love, tradition, and Spain's future collide. And so the story ends where it must, not with answers, but with uncertainty. Whether those words remain hypothetical depends not on romance, but on restraint. On timing, on whether the institution remembers what it exists to protect. The crown has survived by adapting slowly. Never abruptly, never emotionally. The next chapter has not yet been written. And Spain, like the world watching it, stands quietly at the edge of history, aware that what comes next has not yet been decided. The second pressure arrives not from the public, but from inside the institution itself. Because once the crown accepts that marriage is inevitable, the question quietly shifts. Not if it happens, but how much control is lost when it does. Inside royal systems, marriage is treated as a structural event. It alters perception chains. It introduces an additional actor into a carefully balanced equation. Someone who did not grow up absorbing restraint as instinct. For Princess Leonor of Spain, this matters more than it ever did for her predecessors. Spain's monarchy today is constitutional, but memory-driven. It carries the weight of past fractures, moments when private conduct damaged public faith. Those scars are not forgotten. They are studied. For Princess Leonor, marriage is not a private choice, it is a national test, where love, tradition, and Spain's future collide. What few observers acknowledge is that scandal does not erupt at the wedding. It begins earlier, during vetting, hesitation, silence. Every potential partner becomes a mirror. Reflecting class, reflecting ideology, reflecting how insulated, or exposed, the crown truly is. This is where modern risk enters. In earlier centuries, alliances were political by default. Today, politics enters through biography, education, family history, associations that predate royal proximity but suddenly become relevant. The United Kingdom understands this tension intimately. It has watched personal relationships trigger institutional recalibration. The lesson absorbed quietly across Europe is simple. Once symbolism fractures, repair is slow. In the United States, perception follows a different logic. There, monarchy is evaluated not emotionally, but as a stability signal. If Spain's crown appears misjudged or naive, confidence erodes, not in ceremony but in governance optics. Germany, meanwhile, reads restraint as seriousness. Any hint of spectacle is interpreted as weakness. And so the crown hesitates. Not because it doubts Leonor, but because institutions doubt everything by design. This is the living thread of continuity. Personal milestones are allowed only when they reinforce collective assurance. Here lies the second uncomfortable truth. Even a perfect marriage can still destabilize an institution, if it moves faster than public adaptation. Spain is not hostile to its monarchy. But it is alert, sensitive to imbalance, quick to question relevance. Regional identity, generational change, and political polarization have sharpened public attention. What once passed quietly now becomes debated. And debate is dangerous terrain for inherited authority. For Princess Leonor, marriage is not a private choice, it is a national test, where love, tradition, and Spain's future collide. At this stage of the story, the risk is not rejection. It is reinterpretation. If the public begins to see the crown as choosing for itself, rather than serving continuity, legitimacy thins. Not dramatically, incrementally. Institutions rarely fall from impact. They weaken from drift. And that is why silence matters so much now. Why no signals are rushed. Why absence itself becomes a message. Because once the narrative is set, whether of prudence or miscalculation, it cannot be fully reclaimed. The crown knows this, which is why every step forward is measured against what cannot be undone. And why the most dangerous moment has not yet arrived. If you want, I can continue with the third part, where we move into the unspoken red lines, the point where institutional tolerance quietly ends and contingency planning begins. There is a boundary the institution never announces. It exists without documentation, without speeches, without warnings delivered aloud, but it is understood. Every monarchy that survives into the modern age learns where that boundary lies, not from theory but from near failure. For Princess Leonor of Spain, that boundary is not about love. It is about symbolism crossing into autonomy. The unspoken red line appears the moment a personal decision begins to look self-directed rather than institutionally aligned. Not rebellious, not dramatic, simply independent. Independence is admired in private citizens. In heirs, it is watched carefully. For Princess Leonor, marriage is not a private choice, it is a national test, where love, tradition, and Spain's future collide. Inside the palace, the calculus becomes colder here. Questions shift tone, not who is he, but what does he represent once he stands beside her. Because proximity to the crown confers meaning whether intended or not. Background becomes signal, silence becomes implication, ordinary details acquire institutional weight. This is where contingency planning begins, quietly. Not to stop a marriage, but to contain its consequences. The crown prepares for scenarios it never acknowledges publicly. Media narratives drifting out of alignment. Political figures exploiting ambiguity. Regional leaders reframing symbolism to suit their cause. None of this requires scandal. Only opportunity. The United Kingdom learned long ago that the moment a royal partner appears unscripted, the institution must either absorb the unpredictability or shrink to accommodate it. Spain does not have the luxury of shrinking. In Canada and Australia, observers read these moments as early indicators. Not of collapse, but of credibility stress. A monarchy that appears unsure invites debate elsewhere. Germany, ever cautious, reads restraint as competence. Deviation raises questions not about morality, but seriousness. And the United States notices something else entirely. It watches whether the system holds. Because systems that cannot regulate their symbols tend to lose authority far beyond their borders. For Princess Leonor, marriage is not a private choice, it is a national test, where love, tradition, and Spain's future collide. At this stage, the danger is not opposition. It is acceleration. Public affection can move faster than institutional consent. Once momentum builds, hesitation looks like weakness. And weakness invites pressure. This is the point where the crown becomes most conservative. Not ideologically, structurally. Appearances are spaced. Language is refined. Visibility is adjusted. Nothing appears wrong. And that is intentional. Because the red line is crossed not when the public protests, but when the institution loses its ability to slow time. Time is the monarchy's most valuable asset. It allows adaptation without rupture. Adjustment without apology. Lose control of timing, and legitimacy becomes reactive. Spain's crown understands this better than most. It has survived by never appearing hurried, never appearing cornered, and yet, the future cannot be postponed indefinitely. The closer Leonor moves toward adulthood, authority, and inevitability, the narrower the margin becomes. At some point, choice will surface. Not dramatically, but unmistakably, and when it does, the institution will reveal, without saying a word, where its tolerance ends. Because some lines, once crossed, do not trigger scandal. They trigger redefinition, and redefinition is where history begins to shift. In the end, institutions do not announce their verdicts. They reveal them through posture, through pacing, through what is allowed to appear effortless, and what is quietly delayed. For Princess Leonor of Spain, the future narrows into a corridor shaped by precedent rather than preference. Not because the crown is unfeeling, but because it is enduring. For Princess Leonor, marriage is not a private choice, it is a national test, where love, tradition, and Spain's future collide. By now, the question is no longer whether scandal could happen. It is whether the institution can continue to absorb change without asking the country to renegotiate its consent. Spain watches carefully, not with hostility, with memory. The United Kingdom recognizes the stillness before recalibration. Canada and Australia read the signals for what they imply about modern monarchies' limits. Germany measures seriousness in restraint. The United States observes whether the system holds, or improvises. None of them need spectacle to understand what is at stake. Because the most consequential moments in institutional history rarely arrive loudly. They arrive disguised as normal life. A partner standing just out of frame. A future discussed in conditional language. A silence that lasts slightly longer than expected. Continuity is not abstract here, it is embodied in visible presence. In what is shown, and in what is withheld. For Princess Leonor, Marriage is not a private choice, it is a national test, where love, tradition, and Spain's future collide. The crown will not rush. It never has. Speed belongs to movements, not institutions. And yet, time advances regardless of preparation. What comes next will not be decided by romance alone, nor by resistance, but by whether Spain still recognizes itself in the figure meant to carry its continuity forward. Royal scandal. Those words remain suspended, not as accusation, but as possibility. The story does not end here. It pauses. At the edge of history, where choice approaches visibility, and the institution waits, aware that once the future becomes public, it can no longer be contained.